there are many of our people who are thinking more deeply and more broadly, looking at it as it actually is, and are beginning to see it more in the international context and the relation that it has with the African struggle, a human rights struggle, or the struggle for human rights. And as such, we can then take it into the United Nations.
And bring about the freedom of these people by any means necessary.
Hey, peace. This is Ikemba of We Charge Colonialism, here to discuss the G20 Summit that took place on October 30th and 31st. I wanted to discuss the G20 Summit because, these summits and these groups, the 20 that meet, and also the Group 7 that I'm going to get into as well, they have tremendous influence on the political and economic policies that nations adopt throughout the world. So as a result of that, this is significant because it has an impact on African lives, African people, on the continent and the diaspora. And so with that being said, due to the impact that it has on our lives, you would think that, and it has a tremendous impact, you would think that we would have a larger representation at these summits. But no, we don't. And so the reason for that is because most of the nations that make up the G7 and the G20, or all of the nations that make up the G7, most of the countries that make up the G20, let me rephrase that. All of the countries that make up the G7 and G20 have populations that stand to benefit from the economic exploitation of the masses of people in the world. So if we look at the things that was discussed at the G20, that's discussing climate change, tax, global tax, and COVID vaccines, getting people vaccinated. These are important discussions to take place that should be taking place. But when we look at what's happening to African people as far as their dependency on these colonial powers, for African people, the real issue is the transformation of the global economy so that African people are no longer being exploited for their resources and their labor, and politically and socially oppressed. Who are the G20? If we look at the countries that make up the G20 and their impact on the global economy, first of all, the G20 represents an international forum that meets annually. It brings together the world's major economies, and its members account for more than 80% of the world's GDP. So you got 20 nations that are coming together representing more than 80%, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the world's GDP. They're representing 75% of global trade and 60% of the population on the planet. Now, 60%, that's a large number when you think about representation here. But this large number is because of some of the Asian countries such as India and China, who has populations in the billions, right? So when you look at the makeup of the G20, we have Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, Japan, India, Indonesia, Italy, Mexico, Russia, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Turkey, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the European Union. Yes, the European Union. Spain is also invited as a permanent guest. So the G20 is the brainchild of the G7. G20 established in 1999 by the G7, and the G7 is another group that came together to deal with an impending economic crisis. The G7 nations account for, if you look at these nations, who are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and the United States. And the European Union also has representation. But these G7 nations account for close to 60% of the global net worth. That's 60% of the global net worth, 32 to 46% of global GDP, and 10% of the world's population. So you have 10% of the world's population that's making up 60% of the global net worth. That right there is the result or the culmination of colonialism and slavery. This is how this wealth was built, and it also continues to be built because the political economic relationship remains the same. There has been structural changes, but there hasn't been revolution in the political economy. And so now these countries come together to discuss how the discuss governance of the global economic economy, because they stand to benefit because they're in a position due to centuries of exploitation of African people and other oppressed people. They're in a position where they control the wealth of the world. They control the resources of the world, the means of production. And so in order for African people to benefit in the world economy, there has to be a revolution. There has to be a seizing of what was stolen from Africans. And so at these G7 and G20 summits, these conversations that are being had, it's not being had on behalf of African people. South Africa, once again, is the only country out of 55 countries that are that's even represented at the G20, and this is a nation that has a history of white people exploiting the majority of African people that live in that region. So, with that being said, I think we have to keep a close eye on what is being discussed and what impact that it is having. What impact these G20 and G7 summits are having on African lives. We charge colonialism in our book club. Recently we're discussing how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and this book written by Walter Rodney is so relevant to what's happening today because its underdevelopment is still taking place. I just want to read a paragraph from chapter 5, and he's discussing expatriation of African surplus under colonialism, and I think this is really relevant. Capital and African wage labor. Walter Rodney says colonial Africa fell within that part of the international capitalist economy from which surplus was drawn to feed the metropolitan sector. As seen earlier, exploitation of land and labor is essential for human social advance, but only on the assumption that the product is made available within the area where the exploitation takes place. Colonialism was not merely a system of exploitation, but one whose essential purpose was to repatriate the profits to the so-called mother country. From an African viewpoint, that amounts to consistent expatriation of surplus produced by African labor out of African resources. It meant the development of Europe as part of the same dialectical process in which Africa was underdeveloped. I think that's important because, once again, this relationship between Europe and African nations, one of exploitation that has taken place for centuries. And now you have other foreign nations, such as China, who is coming into Africa, who gains the benefit from an economic relationship with Africans who are vulnerable to these developed economies and developed nations, vulnerable to their policies, vulnerable to the corporations that come into these countries to mine mine African lands, exploit them for their diamonds, their cobalt, and etc. Because of this vulnerability, Africans have not had the ability to overturn this relationship, and that's because we are playing within the ground rules of the colonialists. And so the only way that we're going to be able to attain power as African people, to attain our independence as African people on the continent and the diaspora, is a redistribution of the wealth, a complete revolution of the global economy. Anything less than that is a continuation of the current status quo. So I'm Ikemba. We charge colonialism. This is my message, to the people. Revolution in colonialism, wherever it is.